you, Carol, and thank you to the Whatcom County Historical Society for having me. It's such a treat and an honor to be here tonight and share a little bit about my town with all of you. I'd like to take you on a historical tour of Point Roberts. 4 generations of my family have made a living at Point Roberts, and it's a very unique town. In this photo here, the houses that you see are in Canada, and the road is in the United States. And the ditch essentially is the border. But let's start on our tour. We'll go on some tales and trails and trivia about an American exclave, and we'll define what an exclave is as we go along. When I was here last time, I was overwhelmed by how many people in the room had been to Point Roberts. That's very cool. But in case there's anyone here tonight who doesn't know where Point Roberts is, it's there on the map, and of course Point Roberts is famous for being an exclave, meaning you need to get there. If you're going by land or by car, you need to travel through Canada to get there and then re-enter the United States at Point Roberts. One of the questions that I often get when I'm describing this to people back east or from other places is, well, surely there's a ferry. And no, of course, there is no ferry to Point Roberts. There hasn't been for decades and decades. We do have a 1-cent gas tax that we don't have to give to the mainland. We keep that in Point Roberts, and that was supposed to be earmarked for a ferry. That was the purpose of our penny gas tax. And we saved up our money, and in 1998 we actually drew up formal proposals this thick. We knew how much the fare was going to be and how many seats were on the boat, and it was all ready to go. And then in the perennial story of Point Roberts, it all fell through just because it's Point Roberts and it's hard to deal with an isolated piece of the county. In 1953, Whatcom County called Point Roberts its orphan problem child. And it still is today. So let's go on the tour. The border with Canada is essentially the top of the photo up there, and the border crossing that you enter, the only way to enter the town by land, is right there. And so we will start our tour by entering Point Roberts. This is our border crossing, and we had no road access until 1919. Until then, the only way to get there was by boat, and boat remained the dominant way to get to Point Roberts well into the 1930s. It's the 3rd busiest border crossing, Little Point Roberts, on the 49th parallel. A lot of people are surprised to hear that. In fact, it's the 5th busiest city with a border crossing across the entire U.S.-Canadian border. So even though we're small and remote, we have a tremendous amount of traffic coming in. And because of all that traffic, Point Roberts has the #1 per capita Nexus membership in all of North America, me included. I wouldn't live, if I lost my Nexus card, I would move away. 90% of everyone crossing the border are Canadians, only 8% are Americans, and over 4 in 10 spend less than 15 minutes in the Exclave. They are coming to get gas and pick up a parcel. Over half stay less than an hour, so we have a lot of visitors, but they don't stay. So there's the opportunity for Point Roberts, and we're still trying to figure that out. All right, so the Spanish discovered, in terms of European discovery or contact, Point Roberts in 1791 with the Eliza expedition. They named it Isla de Zapeta. They thought it was an island. When they came back the next year, they kind of went around and discovered, oh, this is a peninsula, so it became Punta de Zapeta. And that name stuck for 1 month, because then in June 12th, George Vancouver came along, and he was the first European to set foot on Point Roberts. The Spanish didn't come ashore. So I think we all know on the left is George Vancouver, and so the fellow on the right must be Roberts, and indeed that is Henry Roberts. So they grew up together in the Navy. They met when they were 15 and 16, some records say 14 and 15, and they were in the Navy together. They were on Cook's 2nd voyage together. They were on Cook's 3rd voyage together. They were literally standing shoulder to shoulder on the beach in Hawaii when Cook was murdered. And George went to get the body, and Henry held the Hawaiians back. So George Vancouver named Point Roberts for Henry Roberts. His esteemed friend is how he wrote it in his journals. And it was one of the first times that George actually got into a boat and did some exploring off the main boat himself. It wasn't the first thing he named. He had named other things, but it was the first time he named something when he was in a small boat exploring. And so we really feel that Henry Roberts was a very special naming for him in naming Point Roberts for his friend Henry Roberts. They set out from Birch Bay that morning, and I was just in Birch Bay looking at Point Roberts from Birch Bay to just get a feel for what they were seeing and deciding that was where they wanted to go the morning of June 12th, 1792. All right, so let's start our tour by going over to that northwest corner. That northwest corner has this monument. This is Border Marker Number 1, is its official title. And so the border had been drawn on the 49th parallel to the Continental Divide in 1818, and there it stopped. West of the Continental Divide was no man's land. It was shared territory, more accurately stated, between Britain and America. And eventually we had the Treaty of Washington in 1846, and that extended the border. They just, let's make it easy and continue the 49th parallel out to the coast. But when they wanted to physically mark the border, they didn't do what I would have thought was obvious, was continue from the Continental Divide down the mountains towards the sea, because they had marked it that far. No, in 1857, when it was not easy to get here, they went all the way to Point Roberts and started marking the border back to the Continental Divide. And so the Army engineers, you can see they've cut that swath down through the trees to mark the border, and 4 years later that marker was placed, and it's still there. This is Monument Park. This is a Whatcom County Parks System park, and here it is today, dwarfed by this Canadian home. Now, in 1930, that was a speakeasy and brothel, excuse me, and it was built right up to the line. So someone who wanted to purchase some booze would be standing in Point Roberts in the United States and order his booze out the window from the woman in the Canadian building. And that woman, anyone know the name of the woman? That's Pansy May Studdard. Here she is. So she was Canadian, although she loved American money, but I kind of consider her one of the first female proprietors serving Whatcom County. We can't say in Whatcom County, but serving Whatcom County. And, you know, there was nothing in Tawasin in those days, so this was essentially Point Roberts' house of ill repute. Pansy May's advertising said, "This is a fine place to take your girl, and if you don't have one, we will supply one." Now, if we just kind of pivot around looking east from standing and looking at the monument, we see our border wall. We do have a wall on the northern border. Here it is. It's all of 12 inches high. It's essentially a border curb, I suppose. I see people cross here all the time, although that is illegal to do so. I am not advocating that. But yeah, this is part of Monument Park, and there's no fence here. This is our longest undefended border, and a good example of it in Point Roberts, as well as many places in Whatcom County. So if we continue down the west side of Point Roberts, along the Strait of Georgia to the southwestern corner, we come to the point, the geographic point called Point Roberts, in the southwestern corner. And so on the right-hand side, we see this corner. In 1932, there was floods in 32, and so in 1934, we built a dike along this shore. This is the dike right here, and that then created land behind the dike. That had formerly been a large lagoon in this area here, large enough for a schooner to go in and turn around. And then we diked that and created polders, land behind the dikes behind there. And that's an important area in Point Roberts today. That created some flat land. The rest of Point Roberts is a little hilly. And that enabled us to have our airstrip in 1972. So when there's problems bringing things across the border, which happens all the time, Avian flu, no chickens going from Costco in Bellingham to Point Roberts. Mad cow disease, you're not bringing any beef through Canada to Point Roberts. You can't come home from the stores in Whatcom County. That kind of thing is a modern example of that, but all kinds of things can't go through Canada, and so our airstrip is important, and we now have 4 flights a week to Bellingham on commercial service. And that went in 72, and the marina went in 77, and that was important so that we not only boosted the economy, but for the fishermen who fish off Point Roberts, that's a really important place of safety in a storm, including my grandfather took advantage of that marina when it was built and was glad it was there on one particular storm. Now, this corner was also important much earlier than that. The Fraser Gold Rush started in Point Roberts. Right? So there was a guy in 1857 who was trying to smuggle some booze and sell it to the Army engineers who were cutting that border near the marker there, and he got arrested, and when they frisked him, they found gold dust in his pocket. And he finally admitted that, yeah, he had got that up in the headwaters of the Fraser, and that sparked the Fraser Gold Rush. Went down to Seattle and San Francisco, and suddenly everyone was going to the gold fields. Now, James Douglas, the governor of BC, or back then Vancouver Island, mandated that everyone get a license, come to Victoria to pay $5 for a license to go up there. And so what happened was a town sprung up in Point Roberts to supply these miners, and initially they would go there and sneak into the Fraser River without their permits. Later, James Douglas would blockade that and check for everyone's permits. But this little town was called Robertstown, and there was never any photo of it. We have some vague descriptions of it. We weren't even really sure exactly where it was. There's no foundations or anything. On the left-hand side, just last year in 2018, in a dusty basement in one of the campuses of the University of California, this drawing emerged, and for the first time we see Robertstown, right? So this is the point, right? So this point is here, and it's written, it's hard to see, but it says Point Roberts, 1858. That would be the height of Robertstown, and we can see there's a lot of tents and some buildings there, and so now we have a very good idea of exactly where Robertstown was, probably in this area here. And then it goes up, we see the Tawasin Headland, we see the mouth of the Fraser, and all the way up to Point Grey, where the UBC is. So we're just very, very excited that we now have this image of Robertstown. Let me make one more comment about James Douglas, though. James Douglas, famous for being the governor of Vancouver Island, then British Columbia, then the Combined Colony, and he blockaded Point Roberts, as I said. Well, James Douglas was born in British Guyana, present-day country of Guyana. Well, British Guyana is next to Dutch Guyana, current-day country of Suriname. Used to be all one Dutch colony, and the British Navy came along and essentially stole the western 3 provinces of Guyana from the Dutch to create British Guyana. And so when that happened, Britain needed families to populate these newly acquired colonies, British Guyana. And so James Douglas's father and mother moved there from Barbados and, settled down and had a family, and James Douglas was born there. So who was the British person who liberated British Guyana from the Dutch? Henry Roberts. So James Douglas is blockading the town named for the man who liberated the country of his birth. That's one of my favorite stories. All right. In this southwestern corner is another Whatcom County park. This is Lighthouse Marine Park, part of the Whatcom County Park system. There used to be a lighthouse there, hence the name. It stood for 4 decades and was largely knocked down in 1962 in the Columbus Day storm and was finally fully torn down in 1965. And today we have just a navigational marker, even though the park is named Lighthouse County Park. There's our navigational marker. Right offshore is the water. Great place to see orcas, right offshore. It's deep, deep water, 20, 30, 40 feet offshore, and the orcas are breaching in the summer. Not as often as they do at Lime Kiln, but still a great place to come see orcas. And then we have this character here. This is an art installation called Sunsweep. And it's one big piece of granite, and we have a third of it in Point Roberts. The other 2/3 of this art installation, the other piece of this granite, are in other exclaves. It's an exclave art installation. So how many exclaves are there? Does anyone know how many exclaves there are in North America on the US-Canadian border? There's 6 of them. Do we know where they are? Shall we see? Okay, so here's Point Roberts. That's obviously one of them. Anyone know the biggest exclave? Biggest one in the world? Alaska. Right, so Alaska's an exclave. The next one is the northwest angle. There's where another third of Sunsweep is. That little hump in Minnesota can only be reached from Minnesota by going through Manitoba. Except for in winter, they have an ice road, but we won't get into that. So what this means is either end of the 49th parallel are bookended by exclaves, Point Roberts and the northwest angle. As we go along to the east, there's Akwesasne. That's a piece of Ontario you can only get to by going through New York. It's a native reserve, First Nations land. Then there's the Alberg Tongue. I don't really count this as an exclave. It is. It's a piece of land hanging down from Quebec. It belongs to Vermont. But they have a bridge to get there from the rest of Vermont because there's a town of 2,000 there. So you don't have to go through Quebec to get there from the rest of Vermont. Then we have Campobello Island. Now, islands are not exclaves, but in this case, we do count it as an exclave. So Campobello Island is part of New Brunswick. And in the summer, there's a ferry, so you can take a ferry from mainland New Brunswick to Campobello Island and stay within Canada. But in the winter, when the ferry's not running, the only way to get to Campobello Island from mainland New Brunswick is to drive through Maine, and then there's a bridge from Maine onto Campobello Island. So thus we count it as an exclave. And exclaves have all kinds of problems, as I mentioned, with bringing things through the other country. And so Point Roberts and Campobello Island last year became sister cities so that we can together lobby for rules that would help living in an exclave. So there's a Canadian exclave and an American exclave, and together we can lobby Ottawa and Washington. All right, and so really that means the western end of the US-Canadian border and the eastern end of the US-Canadian border are all exclaves as well, right? And Point Roberts is the northwesternmost point of the continental United States, and Campobello Island and that bridge goes to Lubec, Maine, and Lubec, Maine is the easternmost point of continental United States. So again, there's some similarities on either end of the line. All right, so if we move across the southern shore of Point Roberts, I don't know if you can see, but this is a very dense area right here, full of cabins on tiny, tiny lots. These were originally large homesteads, and then in 1953, the law changed in Washington, and it allowed Canadians to buy property in Washington. And so in 1953, a lot of the old homesteads in Point Roberts were subdivided to create tiny, tiny lots, smaller than I think that would be allowed in zoning today, for cabins. And so this was almost a community within a community within Point Roberts. There was a little store and a beach access, and this place is just chock full of cabins to this day, like the one that we see on the left. This is what many of them look like in terms of their size. This one happens to be on the market right now. If anyone's looking for a good real estate bargain, that home has beach rights, is on the market for $199,000. Canadians own 80% of the property in Point Roberts, and much of it are cabins like that. So who would live in Point Roberts? Canadians, crazy Americans like me, but in the early part of the 20th century, they were Icelanders. Point Roberts was an Icelandic town. The turn of the century, it was half Icelandic. And not just half Icelandic, but the pillars of the community were Icelandic. So well into the 1930s, if you wanted to go to the library, the general store, the post office, if you wanted to see a play, if you wanted to go to church, you better speak Icelandic, because all of those functions were owned by Icelanders who may or may not have had great English skills. By the late 70s, still 1 in 7 people were fully Icelandic, descended from the original Icelandic settlers who came to Point Roberts in 1893, then in large numbers in 1894. They came from Victoria, which was in a recession in those years. And this church is the only church in Point Roberts that's still standing. That was originally the Trinity Icelandic Lutheran Church. Today they've dropped the Icelandic word, but it's still a Lutheran church. All right, so let's continue our tour. Now we're here at Lily Point. This is the southeastern corner of Point Roberts, and it's also the home to the Point Roberts Reef. And we can kind of see the reef coming off Point Roberts here. So this area is very shallow. At a very low minus tide, it's actually exposed, but at a normal tide, it's relatively shallow. And so the big sockeye salmon runs, they're all headed for the Fraser River. They're coming up past Cherry Point. They kind of sense, uh-oh, this is Boundary Bay, dead end. So they make a turn, and then they're all bunched up here trying to get over the reef. And so for millennia, this has been an important fishing location, right? So the Point Roberts Reef, here it is. We see fish traps going out on the reef. Here's the spiller on one close to land. Here's another one. Here's another one. Here's another one. There's some over here, over here. There were more fish traps at Point Roberts than any other place in Washington, and the first fish traps in Washington were at Point Roberts as early as 1878, all the way until they were banned in 1934. And then to deal with all the fish, the Alaska Packers Association built a large cannery on Lily Point that was there from 1893 until 1917. And to go along with all of that, there were 500 pirates who operated in the area, because thousands of fish sitting in a little pen there was just too easy. And so this was the epicenter of piracy in Whatcom County. My father was a pirate. My grandfather, sorry, was a pirate, but he was a clam pirate, not a sockeye salmon pirate, to be clear. All right. But this land was not supposed to be really for Alaska Packers Association. It was really meant to be for the Coast Salish people, right? This was their place, their most important fishing place for thousands of years. They call Lily Point Cheltenham, the place for putting racks for drying salmon. And in this photo that we can date to 1893, we see these fish racks with the salmon hanging on them, drying. Now this is not Lily Point. This is up the beach a little bit from Lily Point. Very faint in the photo, we see the cannery. So the cannery's just gone in. That's the first building, and that land has been commandeered by the white man, and the natives were kind of chased up the beach. The Coast Salish have been reef net fishing at Point Roberts for 1,000 years. Many say that technique was invented on the Point Roberts Reef. And in the Point Elliott Treaty, where they traded Washington for the Indian reservations and the right to fish in their usual and accustomed places, as it's listed in Article 5, the only place that they specifically said, hey, wait a minute, if I sign this, can I still fish there, was Cheltenham, right? It was Point Roberts. If we sign this, and we give up all this land and go live here, can we still fish at Point Roberts? And assured that they could, they signed this treaty. So it's the only place they really specifically called out as important to them. And then this little encampment here did not last long, because by 1894 or 5, a guy by the name of Joseph Goodfellow said he wanted that little part of the beach, and they were moved off of there, and that was the last time they had an encampment on Point Roberts. They still fish there, but they haven't been on shore. And today, Lily Point itself, where that cannery was, all the way up including this area here, this Goodfellows Point, is a Whatcom County park. This is Lily Point Park, part of our Whatcom County park system. Right? And that photo we were just looking at is taken here, just up the beach from the cannery, which was here. All right, so let's go up to the northeastern point of Point Roberts. Today we call that Maple Beach. It's another kind of community within a community, dense cottages. So until the 1930s, this was really downtown Point Roberts, because there was a pier here. And again, most people came by boat. So this was downtown Point Roberts on the west side. And then really in the 50s and 60s into the 70s, most of the action and businesses were up here. Right? And it looks like this. This is what we call Maple Beach today. It was called Boundary Bay back then, and the land on the other side of the border, this is the border here. And so this is still called, in Tawasin, this community is still called Boundary Bay. But we call this area Maple Beach today. There used to be 2 border crossings at Point Roberts. So this was called the Lower Port, and it operated from 1936 to 1976 in the summers. And we see that there were 6 businesses along the shoreline. There was one here, there was a roller skating rink here, there was a business here, here, and one just off of the camera range, and a nice pier, and this beach. This is high tide. At low tide, this goes out for literally a mile of sand. So this was a kind of a resort area. And a lot of people who still have cabins in Point Roberts today have fond memories of coming down here to get ice cream and build little shacks on the beach and this kind of resort lifestyle. There's another business like Pansy May's here. This is built right up to the line. The building's in Canada, but there's no door into Canada. The door goes into Point Roberts. So to go in and have a drink and dance with your special someone, you would enter from Point Roberts and then come back out. And that business looks like this. It was Metcalf's. So here's the dancing, and here's the door. This is Point Roberts here, and they're going into this Canadian business. Eventually, the border officials said, "Well, no, we can't have this," and so the door was closed, and this became a fish and chips window. And you would stand in America and order fish and chips from the Canadian clerk. Now, this area of Maple Beach had a lot of middens, right? These shell heaps of the native people. They were immense. There was 2 very big ones. One was half a mile long, and we're talking 6 or 9 feet high, 2 residential lots wide. And there was another one that was 1.5 miles long, and then lots of other scattered heaps around. So this was just solid middens in this area. And there were formal excavations in 1899, in 1949, the Borden Exposition, and this one is the Seymour Exposition from 1972. We can tell that because of the Velcro. But there are more archaeological remains in Point Roberts than the rest of Whatcom County combined. And today, people still find remnants, relics, artifacts, even human remains when they're digging fence posts or swimming pools or patios and this kind of thing. The Borden excavation of 1949, Borden felt that he was seeing some strange things at Maple Point. And he felt they were so strange and similar to native artifacts from far away that he felt that he had found a unique phase, cultural phase of Coast Salish history at Maple Beach. He called it the Whalen II phase because this was the Whalen family's farm. The Whalens are still in the area. And so for many decades, this was an accepted part of archaeology and anthropology. It has now been debunked. We don't think that Whalen 2 is a distinct phase. We think Borden had some errors in his research, the size of his, the mesh in his pans and all this kind of stuff. So it's been debunked. No one today believes there's a Whalen 2 phase, but for a while people thought Point Roberts was a unique subculture within Coast Salish history. But a lot of very interesting things from this part of Point Roberts. But we find remnants and artifacts like that all over the point, west side of the Point 2. Today, this is the main drag, the business strip of Point Roberts. So let's talk a little bit about the economy of Point Roberts. We had no supermarket and no bank until 1982. So this is before ATMs, when you had to go to the bank to cash a check and withdraw money. And there was no bank to do that. You had to go to Blaine, at best, maybe Bellingham, to do this banking. There was no supermarket. We had some small mom and pop stores, but you had to go to the mainland to buy groceries, and then your ice cream would melt in those fold-up cartons that we used to have, right? And in 1982, we finally joined the modern world with a supermarket and a bank. We had no water system till 1988. We were on well water till 88. It was common in the summer for these wells to go dry, because when all the Canadians come down to fill these cabins, the population of Point Roberts would swell to like 5,000. And there's just not enough water in these wells for 5,000 people. So they would take milk tanker trucks and load them up with water in Blaine and bring them over to Point Roberts to last out the summer. But we got water in 1988 from a contract with Tawasin. 40% of the crossings are for our 60 gas pumps. So that's a lot of gas pumps for not a lot of people. And you notice in the sign that we price our gas in US cents, but it's by liter, not by gallon, because we're catering to our customer base. 20% of the crossings are for parcel pickup, right? You don't want to, if you're Canadian, you don't want to go onto Amazon and then put in a Canadian shipping address, because then you'll have to pay international shipping charges and duty, and it's a very expensive thing. So Canadians like to shop on Amazon.com, not Amazon.ca, because the prices are lower. And then they'll register with one of our parcel depots, and then Amazon will ship the goods to Point Roberts, and then the Canadians will come down and pick the parcel up, put it in the trunk. I hope they declare it, and drive home. And, the smuggling that Point Roberts was famous for is not just years of prohibition kind of smuggling. We still have smuggling to this day, and it goes through these parcel depots. They just busted a rhinoceros horn smuggling ring, and all of those rhinoceros horns were going through Point Roberts, and then they busted the warehouse in Richmond. And the whole warehouse of animal parts, the tigers, all of these animals, and they all had Point Roberts parcel depot labeling on them. So this still happens today. It's the most common business type in Point Roberts. There's more parcel depots than gas stations or real estate offices or anything else. That's our number one business type. And I know Blaine and Sumas have them too, but it's a bigger part of our economy. And as a result, the number of Canadians who have a Point Roberts address, and these are mailing addresses, of course, is a factor of 40 larger than the American population of Point Roberts. And until 1988, we weren't even in a Washington phone area code. We were in British Columbia 604 till the late 80s. Our phone book listings were in the Vancouver phone book. Vancouver was a free call. And then Whidbey Telecom, the telecom for Langley and Greenbank and Freeland, the southern tip of Whidbey Island, they did some investigation and said, hold on, why is BC Tel the telco in Point Roberts? And it turns out they were not properly registered. They were not an official utility with the Washington Utilities Commission. So they got driven out. State of Washington declared Point Roberts an unassigned phone territory as late as '88. And today, our telco is Whidbey Telecom. And so now our phone listings are in the back of the Langley phone book. And we can't call anywhere for free, although long distance isn't really a thing anymore. But that's our funny economy. All right, so let's go down our last stretch of road. This is Gulf Road. Again, the old downtown with the old pier used to be here. But Gulf Road is famous to generations of Canadian, kind of my age and older. If you play name association with someone from Vancouver and say Point Roberts, what do you think of? You think of sin. Point Roberts was called Sin City often in the Vancouver media. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer called it Tijuana of the North. And that was our economy after the war. So after Prohibition, the first 2 taverns to open in Washington were in Point Roberts. The 2 largest taverns in Washington were in Point Roberts, the Breakers and the Reef. Those buildings are still there. This photo's from 1972, and it kind of looks like that today. So the top photo here is on our pier looking onto shore. My grandpa used to tie up his boat. He brought the mail from Bellingham to Point Roberts in the 30s and fished, and he'd come in here. This was a post-Prohibition tavern. This was a post-Prohibition tavern. Then this photo is looking out to sea. And we can still see in 72 the pier, largely intact, although they kind of cut a hole so you couldn't go onto it because it wasn't stable. So the Reef was the number 2 pull tab venue in Washington. And so Canadians would not only come to Point Roberts to drink, they would come to Point Roberts to gamble. And all of this was because there were draconian drinking laws in British Columbia, one of which was no alcohol could be sold on Sunday. And so every Sunday, from 1943 to 1986, poor Point Roberts, population 500, could have as many as 10,000 Canadians every single Sunday coming down to drink beer and watch some football. The record was 16,000 Canadians in one Sunday for 500 people. And, today the roads are nice with padded shoulders. Back then, it was, these county roads like we have in the county, where they're narrow and deep ditches. And, there was a joke about how many cars were in the ditch, and there was beer bottles everywhere and urination, and it wasn't nice. Why did this end in 1986? Of course, that was Expo 86, ended the Sunday drinking ban in British Columbia, right? You can't have a World's Fair and not allow people to drink. So in 1986, British Columbia ended that law, and that killed the Point Roberts economy overnight. The Sunday after that law went into effect, that huge tavern, the Breakers, that can seat 1,000 or more, there were 2 people there. So the other thing that happened in Point Roberts was this building. Today it's a parcel depot, of course, and a country store. But from 1971 to 1989, it was the number 1 X-rated theater in America. Pornography was strictly restricted and controlled in BC. It still is. There's still very strict laws on obscene materials. And so this was that theater. Eventually there was a case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court that talked about where can adult businesses be located. And, is there a free speech right that they can be located anywhere, or are cities allowed to zone them away from schools and parks and things like that? And that case went to the Supreme Court because of actions in Point Roberts. The parent company of this theater was based in Renton, and the actual case was based on a Renton theater, but the actions in Renton were done because of what they were seeing in Point Roberts. So we're kind of responsible for the case that was passed. It is legal to zone adult businesses. Cities can do that. There's not a free speech right that they can be anywhere they want. All right, so that is another aspect of history of Point Roberts. So let's see, we have some drinking, we have some gambling, we have some adult material. I think we're missing the rock and roll. So Randy Bachman had been in the Guess Who, based out in Vancouver. And when the Guess Who disbanded, Randy Bachman took his proceeds from that amazingly successful rock band and formed Bachman Turner Overdrive. And he had no plan B. This BTO had to work, had to be successful, and he knew he couldn't be as successful as he needed to be only in the Canadian market. He needed to be in the American market, but he wasn't going to get American radio airplay with a Canadian address. So, Randy Bachman's address was the Breakers Tavern that we saw in the last photo. And they formed BTO in Point Roberts, taken care of business. Their first big smash was essentially perfected in Point Roberts. There was an older version of that with the Guess Who, but the Guess Who didn't really think it was their sound, and so he took that and kind of tweaked it a little bit, had the music a little harder that was more popular in those days, and that became the sound. And that was coined or formed in Point Roberts. They lived in Point Roberts. They mentored other Canadian bands who wanted to break into the American market in Point Roberts and taught others how to do the same in Windsor, Detroit, and in Buffalo and Niagara Falls, and played a lot of concerts in the Breakers. And then a couple years later, Heart lived in Point Roberts, right? They were formed in Bothell. They kind of lived in Kirkland. And then, and we know Heart, right? These two were a couple, and these two were a couple. And then this guy got drafted. And he decided that he would go to Vancouver as opposed to the draft. And so now one member of the band's in Vancouver. So the rest of the band moved to Point Roberts, so that they could then easily get into Vancouver to play some gigs. And then the guy in Vancouver could kind of sneak over the border. They're home. I give tours of Point Roberts, and I can show you the Heart House. That's the highlight of the tour. And it's close to the border, and he'd kind of sneak over and hang out with his girlfriend and the band. And it was while they were in Point Roberts, in this cute little A-frame cabin, that they wrote Dreamboat Annie, including the hits Crazy on You and Magic Man. And they write about this in their memoirs, exactly what it was like to write Crazy on You and where they got stuck and what life was like in this A-frame cabin and what they were experiencing with one of the band, over the border stuck in Canada and the strife and this hardship. And that's where Crazy on You came from. It came from their life in Point Roberts, right? So Point Roberts has quite a rock and roll history. And then after 1986, those big taverns were empty because Canadians didn't need to come down anymore. They could drink at home. So those big taverns became rock and roll venues. And for another 15 years, there were regular rock concerts in those big taverns by big-name Canadian bands, especially the Vancouver ones. Trooper would come down quite a bit and played for a quarter century in those bands. And so for a long time, Point Roberts was a rock and roll venue location, essentially for greater Vancouver, but here in our county, in Whatcom County. So I think that's a neat and often overlooked part of the history of Point Roberts and of Whatcom County, I must say. Now, I'll end my talk here on the International Joint Commission. In the early 70s, late 60s and early 70s, Point Roberts was a mess. Whatcom County was tired of hearing about it. Vancouver and BC was tired of hearing about it. We had no water. We had no garbage service. I mean, things were a mess. And we were, always raising issues, and no one wanted to deal with it, and no one would accept responsibility. Canada would say, it's not our problem, that's American territory. And Americans would say, well, we're not going to give money to Point Roberts because it just helps Canadians. And so what do you do about Point Roberts? So the IJC is this international body that kind of governs things on either side of the line, usually water rights. So Ross Dam in, Whatcom or Skagit County, but the reservoir goes back up into Canada. So the IJC governs a lot of how that works and everything. And so there was a deal that said, okay, if the IJC keeps working on Ross Dam, you have to also figure out Point Roberts, fix Point Roberts. And so there was all kinds of proposals. I could do a whole talk just on the IJC, but two of the proposals were, one was to create a private city of 25,000 people. So kind of like Disney Corporation has Celebration, Florida, a corporate city. That's what they were going to do in Point Roberts. 25,000 people in 1973. The population of Bellingham was barely 35,000. This would have, today Lyndon's the second largest city, but back then it had less than 5,000 people. This is what they were going to build in Point Roberts. That proposal did not end up happening, neither did. The other one was to create an international park just like on Campobello Island. That had gone in 1963, and everyone thought that's a good idea, but that would have necessitated depopulating Point Roberts. If you died, if you sold your home, you would have to sell it to the park. If it burned down, you would not be allowed to rebuild it. You must sell it to the park. You could stay there until one of those three things happened. And eventually there'd be no pesky people to have to figure out water rights for. That didn't happen either. The IJC ended with no recommendation for Point Roberts, and a lot of the problems that we had in those days have been fixed, but some haven't. Some of the things that they were looking at, healthcare and whatnot, are still problems in Point Roberts today. So it's a unique town. It's a fragile town. So I appreciate all of our friends on the mainland kind of looking out for us and speaking up for us when you hear about the troubles that we have living in a remote exclave, a unique geographic entity right here in Whatcom County. And with that, thank you so very much.
Could you tell us some more about your own family? I'm just curious.
My family came in 1910 to Whatcom County, and originally were Dungeness crab fishermen, and eventually got into sockeye salmon fishing, all kinds of salmon fishing, gill netting and purse seining, and they lived in Bellingham, but did almost all of their fishing at Point Roberts. And so my great-grandpa was the first to come here. He had left Croatia and then went to New Zealand and was a gum digger there. And then he heard about Bellingham and Point Roberts in the Salish Sea and decided to leave New Zealand and come up here to Whatcom County. And we've been a continual presence in Whatcom County since then.
Hey, so I bought the book, I read the book, I love the book, and I swear I'm not an audience plant. But I was just wondering if there was anything that didn't quite make the book. It just got cut last minute.
No, it's a hefty book, so I probably am more guilty of not taking anything out. But no, I know there's things I've learned since then about things I wrote about, so I could have written more. But I don't think anything fell to the cutting room floor.
Is there still a campground in Point Roberts, or camping?
Yes, there is. The Whatcom County Park at Lighthouse Park has a campground. And as Whatcom County residents, you get a cheap rate at camping there. It's open in the summer.
Could you elaborate a little on Gene Kaniski?
Yes, Gene Kaniski is the father of the owner of the Reef. And he was a professional wrestler, and his son, Nick Kaniski, bought the Reef. For a time, he owned the breakers as well, and he still owns it. He recently renovated it, and there's a lot of photos of Gene Kaniski on the wall. And so his wrestling history is kind of a part of the decor there and a fun part of Point Roberts' history as well. So yeah, it's another kind of famous person that has an association with the Point.
How much reef netting still goes on off of Point Roberts, and is it mostly lummy or?
So the reef netting is in Boundary Bay where I see it, so a little closer to Blaine than Point Roberts. We mostly see purse seiners and gill netters off Point Roberts today. Occasionally I do see lummies there with canoes, but I haven't really seen a reef netting operation with the ladders on the boats and the whole net between them right offshore. So they get close, but they're a little closer to Blaine.
What about the schools there? Do you have a high school, a regular high school, an elementary school?
So no, we don't have those schools. We have a small primary school that does kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and in some years, depending on enrollment and funds, we'll have a third grade. Currently, we do have a third grade, and at fourth grade, all the children get on buses to Blaine every day. Relatively young kids are away from their folks with their passport or Nexus cards on a bus all the way through Canada, all the way through the Peace Arch border crossing to the Blaine School District. And then the bus leaves right after school, so it's challenging for those children to do after-school activities, because then they'll miss the bus and their parents have to come over from Point Roberts and get them. It's a big challenge for the school children of Point Roberts. Something I probably should have pointed out, yeah, because that's a very unique feature of our life there.
How do you pirate a clam?
Quickly. And so you go at night with a light and you dig as fast as you can and you harvest clams that you might use in Dungeness crab pots for bait, so I'm told, and then leave quickly. And yeah, that's what my family did.